4 years, my life had been quiet, predictable, almost motionless. The house I lived in had once been full of noise, my son's laughter echoing down the halls, the hum of conversation over dinner, the occasional slamming of doors as he stormed off in frustration. But those days were long gone. Now, the only sounds were the ticking of the clock, the rustling of leaves outside my window, and the steady creak of the rocking chair where I spent my evenings reading. I had never thought much about loneliness. It had crept into my life so slowly that I hadn't even noticed its weight pressing down on me. I had routines that filled my days: morning coffee on the porch, tending to my small garden, watching the world go by without truly being a part of it. And for the longest time, I had convinced myself that this was enough. That I no longer needed excitement, that the part of me that had once longed for connection had simply faded away with age. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. My son, Eric, called unexpectedly. We spoke regularly, but this time there was something different in his voice. He wasn't just checking in, he had a request. One of his friends, a man around 30, needed a place to stay temporarily. Just a few months, maybe less. A room in my house stood empty, and Eric thought it would be a good arrangement. I hesitated. The idea of sharing my space again, after years of solitude, felt foreign. But Eric assured me that his friend, Adam, was respectful, easygoing, and in need of a quiet place to get back on his feet. It was difficult to say no to my son, and before I could think it through, I agreed. The day Adam arrived, I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. It was absurd, really. What was there to be anxious about? And yet, as I heard his car pull into the driveway, my heart fluttered with an unfamiliar anticipation. I smoothed my dress, ran a hand through my graying hair, and stepped outside to greet him. He was nothing like I had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and a presence that filled the space around him. He carried himself with a relaxed confidence, the kind that comes with youth, with knowing the world still holds endless possibilities. When he extended his hand, I hesitated for just a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was firm, warm, lingering just long enough to send a small, unexpected jolt through me. I led him inside, showing him to his room, making polite conversation about the house, the neighborhood, the few rules I had. But my mind was elsewhere, caught on something I couldn't quite name. It had been years since I had been so aware of another person's presence. Years since I had noticed the way someone's voice could settle into a room, the way their laughter could stir something deep inside me. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself listening. To the faint sounds of him unpacking, to his footsteps moving across the floor. My home, which had been silent for so long, suddenly felt alive again. And with that realization came another, one that unsettled me far more than I was willing to admit. Something within me had woken up. In the days that followed, I found myself noticing Adam more than I had anticipated. It wasn't intentional, at least, I told myself that. But his presence in my home was impossible to ignore. The way he moved, effortlessly comfortable in a space that had been mine alone for so long, the way his voice filled the quiet rooms, turning the once hollow house into something that felt warm again. I would catch glimpses of him in the morning, his hair still damp from the shower, his shirt slightly wrinkled as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He moved through the house like he belonged there, like he had always been a part of it. And maybe, in some strange way, I wanted him to be. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the soft creaks of the floorboards as he moved around in his room, the distant hum of his voice when he spoke on the phone. I wondered who he was talking to. A friend? A lover? The thought sent a strange pang through me, one I refused to name. I started paying more attention to myself. It was subtle at first. A new shade of lipstick. A different style of blouse. I convinced myself that it was just a desire to feel fresh, to break out of the monotony that had settled over me for years. But deep down, I knew better. One afternoon, I found myself lingering in the kitchen as he sat at the table, scrolling through his laptop. He glanced up, offering me a lazy smile, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. There was something about the way he looked at me, not just politeness, not just the casual acknowledgement of a guest to a host. Something else. Or maybe that was just my imagination, a fantasy I had allowed to take root. As the days stretched on, my thoughts became harder to control. I thought about the way his hand had lingered in mine the day he arrived. I thought about the warmth of his voice, the way he carried himself with an ease I had long forgotten in myself. I was old enough to know better. Old enough to understand the foolishness of indulging in fantasies that could never be real. But that didn't stop them from coming, from creeping into my quiet moments, from settling into the spaces he had unknowingly filled. And the more I tried to push them away, the stronger they became. One evening, I walked past his room and saw the door slightly ajar. Inside, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back slightly hunched as he scrolled through his phone. The warm glow of the lamp cast soft shadows across his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the relaxed curve of his mouth. He looked peaceful, unguarded. I lingered for a moment too long, watching. A part of me wanted to step inside, to ask him something trivial just for the sake of speaking to him, for the sake of breaking the silence. But instead, I turned away quickly, my heart pounding, ashamed of myself for even considering it. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how absurd it all was. I had spent years learning to be content with solitude, convincing myself that I no longer needed companionship in any real way. And yet, here I was, losing sleep over a man half my age, a guest in my home, who had no idea of the effect he was having on me. I needed to regain control of myself, to remind myself that this was nothing more than a passing thought, a temporary fascination. But deep down, I knew the truth, this wasn't fading. It was only growing stronger. The moment came without warning, an impulse I couldn't resist. It was late, the house silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind tangled in thoughts I shouldn't have entertained. Sleep was impossible. The weight of my own longing pressed against me like something physical, something undeniable. I rose without thinking, padding softly down the hall, my bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. His door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the darkened hallway. I knew I should turn around, retreat to my room, let the moment pass. But I didn't. I lingered in the doorway, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs. Adam was there, sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to me, unaware of my presence. His head was bowed slightly, his fingers scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone. The sight of him, so relaxed, so unaware of my inner turmoil, sent a shiver through me. I hesitated, torn between desire and reason. But desire won. I stepped forward, my presence finally alerting him. He turned, surprised, his brows lifting slightly as he met my gaze. I couldn't speak at first, couldn't find the words to justify why I was standing there in the middle of the night, why I was looking at him like he was something forbidden yet necessary. He said my name, soft and questioning, and that was all it took. I reached for him, the space between us vanishing in an instant. But the moment my fingers brushed against his arm, I felt it, the hesitation, the unspoken boundary I had just crossed. Adam stiffened, pulling back ever so slightly. The warmth I had imagined, the silent understanding I had convinced myself was there, did not exist. He was not meeting me in this space I had created in my mind. Instead, he was frozen, unsure, waiting for me to step away. Realization crashed over me like cold water. I had misread everything. The small moments, the lingering glances, the easy smiles, they had never been anything more than kindness. My fantasies had twisted them into something they were not. Shame burned through me, hot and merciless. I withdrew my hand quickly, as if I had been burned, murmuring something, an apology, an excuse, I wasn't sure. My vision blurred as I turned and walked away, faster than necessary, my body trembling with humiliation. Back in my room, I sank onto the bed, pressing my palms against my face. I had been foolish, reckless. I had crossed a line that could never be erased. And worse, I had just made myself a stranger in my own home. The morning after was unbearable. I had barely slept, my mind replaying every second of the night before in excruciating detail. I had never felt so exposed, so foolish. The weight of my actions settled deep in my chest, suffocating me, making it hard to breathe. I stayed in my room longer than usual, hoping to avoid him, to delay the inevitable moment when our paths would cross. But the house was only so big, and hiding forever was not an option. Eventually, hunger and routine pushed me toward the kitchen, though my movements felt slow, hesitant. Adam was already there. He stood by the counter, pouring himself coffee, looking as though nothing had changed. As if the night before had never happened. But the stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes flickered to me and then quickly away, told me otherwise. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to make it right. But how could I? There were no words that could undo what I had done. No way to erase the look in his eyes when he had realized what I wanted from him. Morning, I forced out, my voice weaker than I intended. He hesitated, then nodded. Morning. And that was it. No anger, no accusations, just distance, a silence heavier than words. It was worse than if he had yelled, worse than if he had told me outright how uncomfortable I had made him. Because this silence, this unspoken awkwardness, made it clear that nothing would ever be the same again. For the next few days, we danced around each other like strangers occupying the same space. Our interactions became brief, polite, careful. Gone were the casual conversations, the easy laughter. I felt his avoidance like a physical wound, each moment a reminder of the mistake I had made. Then, one evening, as I passed by the living room, I heard his voice low, murmuring into his phone. I wasn't eavesdropping, not at first, but his words stopped me in my tracks. No, it's weird now. I don't know, man. I think she actually thought something could happen between us. Yeah, I know. It's just sad. The air was sucked from my lungs. A cold numbness spread through me, rooting me to the spot. I had known, of course. Known that I had made a mistake, known that he hadn't felt the same. But hearing him say it, hearing the pity in his voice, the amusement, it was unbearable. I backed away slowly, retreating to my room before I could hear any more. My hands trembled as I shut the door behind me, pressing my back against it, as if I could keep the reality of his words from creeping in any further. I had thought rejection was the worst thing I could experience. I had been wrong. Humiliation was worse. Days passed, each one dragging slower than the last. The weight of my shame made even the simplest tasks unbearable. I barely left my room, avoiding the living spaces we once shared. The house, which had felt alive with his presence, now seemed suffocating, each corner a reminder of my mistake. One morning, I awoke to the sound of movement, boxes being shifted, drawers opening and closing. A quiet, methodical kind of noise, the sound of someone preparing to leave. Panic seized me before I could stop it. I stumbled out of bed, my breath uneven as I stepped into the hallway. Adam was there, his suitcase already packed, his belongings stacked neatly by the door. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. I searched for something in his face, regret, anger, even relief, but there was nothing. Just polite detachment, the kind that stung more than any cruel words could have. "I found another place," he said simply, as if he were telling me about the weather. "Didn't want to make things uncomfortable for you." For me. As if he were the one who had to be considerate. As if this wasn't my fault. I wanted to protest, to ask him to stay, to tell him that we could pretend none of it had happened. But I couldn't. I had already crossed a line that couldn't be redrawn. So instead, I nodded. "I understand." And with that, Adam picked up his bags and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the quiet, empty house that now felt colder than ever.